What is going on, everyone? It is me, Mr. Mario. Now, I apologize if the mic quality is going to be a little iffy on this whole video. I'm actually using my built-in camera mic right here to do this, but I'm showing you all a bunch of stuff here, and I'm making this video because a lot of people have asked, Mario, how do you solder? How did you get into it and whatnot? Because if you followed my channel for the past few years, I pretty much went from not soldering anything to actually showing myself soldering and showing a few modifications that require soldering and such. And I like to think, as someone who's been soldering for less than a year, I'm kind of decent at it. I'm not going to say I'm good, I'm not going to say I'm excellent, I'm decent. I can at least get the stuff to work, and I can confidently say that ever since I learned how to solder properly, I have not broken anything on accident. I'm going to get to the on accident thing in a little bit, but anyways, don't let it scare you. Now, first off, people have asked, what should I get to solder? Where should I start? Everything like that. Well, first off, we're going to go over the basics and such. And my goodness, you know, I don't even have everything available here, unfortunately. But I'm just going to have to go to the side here and pick up some of this stuff. Now, first off, anything that people need is rubbing alcohol, and get some good rubbing alcohol. Now, you don't have to get like name brand stuff, but by good I mean you need a high percentage. 91% rubbing alcohol is real good. That's what I use. You can pick it up at a local supermarket, anything like that. We're just going to go ahead and put that in the corner. And then with that, of course, if you're going to be working on, I'm assuming the people watching this video who follow my channel, you know, are kind of into the Xbox 360 modding scene and such. So I'm assuming you're going to want to work on PCB boards, RF boards, motherboards. You also need Q-tips. You can't have enough Q-tips on hand if you're doing multiple systems. So rubbing alcohol and Q-tips, these are your best friends when it comes to soldering. You need these. Now, one thing I will say that I really doubted that I would need until I used it on my first soldering job, and I swear to you guys, it really saved me. You need some flux. Now, people who have not soldered before might think that they don't need flux, and you know, first off, well, I haven't used it in a bit, so it is a bit hard to get off. But once you get it off, as you can see, it is this jelly type substance, and it does have a strong smell to it. You can't really get the smell on the camera, but I opened this up in front of a friend of mine, and personally I like the smell, but he started coughing as soon as I opened it. But anyways, this stuff, it looks messy, it looks nasty, and you might be wondering how the hell it helps. Well, this stuff actually makes everything in solder world a lot easier. It creates a quicker bond. It allows everything to get soldered together a lot easier. Just there's nothing bad about flux. There's absolutely nothing bad about flux. I mean, it might look a little, you know, nasty and such, but aside from that, it really helps you out and it will save your jobs. Trust me on that. There's different types of flux you can get. As you can see, I got most of my stuff from Radio Shack because Radio Shack is literally the only place in town that sells stuff like this, and I'm still on my first cup of flux. I've barely even used it really, even though I've used it a lot. Like, there's so much in there. And there's a lot of other flux you can get, but you just need some type of rosin flux. Now, one thing a lot of people who solder a little bit but they don't solder that much is they say, oh, well, you know, there's flux in the solder, it doesn't matter. Trust me, I know there is a rosin core in most solder. I know there is flux technically in solder, but you need extra flux. Just trust me on this. Unless you are only doing wires, like you are only soldering wires together, you need flux. Just trust me on that. Now that I've preached about flux for a lot, when it comes to solder, there's definitely different types of solder. You can get a whole lot of sizes out there. I use the 6040 rosin core solder, and believe it or not, solder can go bad. Trust me, I've seen some solder that a friend of mine had for years, and the thing was hard as a rock. We couldn't even get it to melt or anything. So, I mean, your solder should really, you know, bend easily like this. It should be, you know, morphable and everything like that, like Play-Doh, really. And then you melt it and such when you light it up. This 6040, this is pretty much standard for what I'm doing. I've done, you know, anything from JTAGs to RJTAG systems, to soldering tiny LEDs to boards and such, and this has worked for everything. So 6040 is my friend. That's the only thing I have on here that I've really needed, the only type of size I've needed. Now, you're going to need something to clean off your soldering tip as well. I use this type of stuff, which I don't even know what it's called, but it looks a lot like confetti, and really all you do is when you're soldering iron, it gets a little bit nasty, you just take it and you just kind of clean it up in there. and then your soldering iron looks all nice and shiny afterwards. So there's actually an alternative to this. A friend of mine told me about it, and she was saying that, yeah, she was saying that you could pretty much use steel wool, and that mostly does the same thing, and even if you want to, you could put it into like a nice little container of some kind, as long as like it doesn't like burn through or anything. But you know what, I got this. I paid like $9-10 bucks for it. I'll probably do the steel wool method whenever this goes bad, but I've done quite a few systems, quite a few jobs with this, and still alright, so that's good for now. With this, you're also going to need desoldering braid if you're going to be doing a lot of soldering jobs. Desoldering braid, what this stuff does, let's say you're soldering some stuff together and oh no, you're soldering some things together and then you soldered two pads together that aren't supposed to be there. What you do is you take your desoldering braid and you just put it over these, like over where the pads would be, and then you just take your soldering iron and you heat this up, and it heats up the copper that is the soldering braid, well, the desoldering braid, and then it sucks up all the solder onto the desoldering braid, and there you go. It cleans it up. It's kind of like your eraser of some kind. So desoldering braid, I cannot recommend that enough, especially if you are just getting into this. Now this right here, this is wrapping wire or Kynar wire. It goes by either name. A buddy of mine called it Kynar wire. A few people I know actually called it Kynar wire. And when I went over to Radio Shack, listen, no offense to Radio Shack, but these guys, I swear I've been soldering way less than these guys and I knew more than any of them. It was pretty bad, but they had no idea what Kynar wire was, and they were saying, oh, well, you could just use speaker wire. No. I cannot use speaker wire to do an exploit on a console, but enough of that. No more rage. Anyways, this is called wrapping wire or Kynar wire, and it is just, it's really hard to get on here because it's very, very thin, but it's really just metal wire that connects things together, and you just strip this bit off. Now to strip it off, I use these fingernail clippers, so you could use that. I don't use these on my fingers anymore, but you can just use those, kind of put down some pressure, pull it off, and you can connect things together. I don't really use it that much, but it's nice to have it on hand. A friend and I have had to use it a few times on some botched solder jobs, and then we saved them. Finally, if you're going to be doing LEDs, small things, removing things, things like that, tweezers. Tweezers, these things help. You can steal them from your mom, your sister, your significant other, or just buy them at the store for like $1. Like seriously, they're cheap everywhere. Even if you go to like a gas station, which is the most expensive place you're going to get them at, they're like $2. Now you also might be looking at this and wondering what the deal is with all these wires. I actually use these for practice, and I've actually used these for a JTAG exploit one time. Now these, I don't really know where you could get them at, and there's a phone number on here as well too, so I guess if this company wants some recognition, I guess they get it on here. But I actually got these wires from a computer engineering course that I took. Now, you don't need to take the computer engineering course to get a box like this. You could just get a box of like assorted wires and jumpers and such from Radio Shack or online or any place. But these really do help out. As you can see, everything is just, it's insulated right here, and then you got some metal here, and they are very nice for soldering. And I've actually used these wires. The class totally helped out because I actually JTAG'd for the first time there. I didn't JTAG an Xbox. I was actually using like JTAG Altera boards, like more than what most people might think JTAGs do. But anyways, I was using these as practice really for soldering, and they work really well. So I'm going to be using things like this, but you can get any type of similar wires. It really doesn't matter where. And I've really covered everything on here. Now, you might be wondering, Mario, you're talking about soldering. What type of soldering iron do you recommend? What type of soldering gun do you recommend? I want to talk about that too. Now, as you can see right here, I have this Radio Shack brand soldering iron. It's a very basic soldering iron. It goes from 0 to 40 watts. 50 watts, actually. And honestly, I used it on quite a few systems, and it's not bad. The iron itself is not bad. However, the tips are abysmal. They have a very short lifespan, and I don't know what happened in the past like 2 years, maybe 2-3 years. Maybe Radio Shack contracted out with another company that's putting out lower quality tips, because I've run into other people online that have said that Radio Shack tips just do not last. And remember that bit where I said I've been soldering for way less than anyone in Radio Shack and I knew more than them? Well, Before I replaced this thing, I still have it, but I'm not using it anymore. Before I replaced it, I actually took it into Radio Shack, and I was buying a new tip. I bought like 3 tips for this thing, and I asked the manager, because the manager soldered a decent amount in the back, but the guys at my local Radio Shack, they only solder wires together. That's all they do. They don't do any type of motherboards and whatnot. But I talked to him, and I said, you know, the problem is I'm taking proper care of these. You know, I'm cleaning them up real well. I'm using all the proper stuff. I run them at no more than like 30 watts. Normally with a soldering iron like this, I would like run it at 30 watts to power it up, like to warm it up, and then I bring it down to 20 or 25. But I said, you know, I'm not using it for more than an hour or two at a time, but the tips of the soldering irons were disintegrating, like badly. Like as in like I would get less than 10 hours on a tip and it wasn't reliable anymore. And this guy, he had no idea what to recommend. He was asking, did you do this? Did you do this? Did you do this? And I said, yes, I treat these things like diamonds. And he was just stumped. He's like, well, you know, I've had the same tip in the back for 3 years and it works fine. So his advice really didn't help me. I decided to get a whole new soldering iron. But if you want to get started on a soldering iron, you know, I'd kind of recommend getting a Radio Shack one like this. Make sure if you get a soldering iron, for the love of God, make sure it's a selectable wattage one. And for most consoles and such, just do what I do. Like, you don't need more than 30 watts. You could do most jobs at 20 to 25 watts. That's really what you need. Anything more, you're going to really risk breaking the components and whatnot. And actually, when I first got this thing, just to test it, I turned it all the way up. And the thing actually busted and got stuck at like 40. So my first ever successful solder job, I soldered a mod chip to a PlayStation 1 at 40 watts the whole time. So every time it got too hot, I had to unplug the damn thing. And then I was able to, you know, get it unstuck, but that was not a fun endeavor. Radio Shack really doesn't have the best quality soldering irons, and the good quality ones they have, they are overpriced. But if you're really just wanting to get your feet wet, dabble into it a bit, it's not that bad wasting $20 on a soldering iron here. However, I will show you all the soldering iron that I do have now. We'll just go ahead and put this to the side. Now, here is the soldering iron I have. I literally went on Amazon and I got like probably the cheapest or the second cheapest one. It's a Stahl brand, which is a hell of a lot better than the stuff Radio Shack has. I'm just going to go ahead and adjust the focus right here, make it auto. And you know what? The funny thing is, a friend of mine was actually wanting to buy. First off, I had a friend come over and he recommended this soldering iron. He just looked up online. He said, Danny, get this. It is much better than that Radio Shack junk that you're using now. And I actually have a friend of mine who really wants this soldering iron. They were saying they want to replace theirs to get one of these. So, you know what? If you're watching, you're going to get to see this thing in action. And hopefully I'm better with it now. But anyways, I'm going to go ahead and open it up. Now, first off, another thing that another friend of mine told me, this guy in particular uses a really good soldering iron. And he had told me before that a soldering iron is normally good. Like, what separates the good ones from the bad ones are the bad cheapo ones. Everything is integrated into the soldering iron like this. Just, you know, it's just a plug and play essentially. The real good ones have a separate base right here. Because as you can see, there's a cable going out here for power, and there's a cable right here for the soldering iron itself. And then, you know, you just connect everything and you're good to go. Now, some people might be looking at this and wondering, Mario, why aren't you talking about the sponge? Why don't you recommend it? You know, I really don't recommend using a sponge for cleaning off a tip, especially like there's normally, in general, they're just not good for tips. I've never really had, you know, good luck keeping a tip good and keeping the soldering iron, well, the sponge clean at the same time. Normally, it does more damage than good to the soldering iron, in my opinion. Just get something like this, and you're going to treat your tips really, really well. One thing with this as well is that the tips on here are much higher quality. Now, one thing about that is I actually end up buying brand new tips for this thing. Reason being is that I have assorted tips right here, and with this, I just went on Amazon and I just looked up like Stahl soldering iron tips, and they had a package of 4. The problem with this was the soldering iron is not that bad. I actually like it. I'll turn it up a little bit there. I like the soldering iron a lot. The problem is the tip I got with it was much too rounded, and it was not fine enough for the jobs I needed to do. For wires, for things like that, it was great. But for motherboards, for consoles, for RF boards, for LEDs, it was way too round. I could not get a good grip on my jobs and such. And if I did, I was almost like breaking the board and such. So what I did was I just, got a new bag of tips. I took the finest one that was in there, and I put it on the top, and as you can see, it's handling pretty well. Now, I will say the Radio Shack ones are a lot finer when you first get them, but after you use them for about an hour or two, they look a bit like this. So this is really what you should be used to. Now also, if you get a brand new soldering iron, all this is going to be nice and shiny and chromed out. After like an hour of use, it's going to look all browned up and such. Just don't worry, that's how it looks. But yeah, this one, you could easily replace the tip on here, which, okay, it's funny I said easily because I can even pull that off, but I just used like some pliers and just put it on there real tight because I didn't want the tip to come out while I'm soldering something. But yeah, this is pretty much what it is. So I'd really recommend getting this type of soldering iron. I only paid about $30 for it, and it's much higher quality and it's much more reliable than the Radio Shack one. The Radio Shack one, as I said, it works, but you're going to have to keep buying tips. And $5, $10 for tips and you get a bunch of them, you could just invest that money in a second soldering iron, just like I did. Now, a few things I want to mention about the environment itself. Let's go ahead and move this to the side here. One, you want to work in a place with a lot of light and such, and you want to be comfortable when you're soldering. You don't want a bunch of distractions around you, so any kids, any little siblings, any older siblings even, just get them out of the room, because if you're working on something real delicate, you don't want to bust it. You also want a decent amount of ventilation, so I work in my kitchen mostly, and actually I've started working over at my table in front of my TV now, because I can sit down there and be nice and comfortable. I'm doing the tutorial right here though, because it gives me more lighting for the camera and such, so you all can see better. I'm doing this for you all. Don't worry, I got you. But right here, like since I'm next to my stove, I have this little fan right here that you're gonna hear. Yep. I normally run that while I'm soldering and such, but I also use masks as well. So this is just like kind of a home dust mask, and I even have another one. I was using some other masks that people normally use when they're sick. I'm not going to be using the mask on this because it's going to obstruct my voice and whatnot, and you're not going to hear me as well. I'm going to be a lot more muffled, but I'm just going to try and hold my breath as much as I can. But I really recommend, if you're soldering, just wear a mask or something to at least not inhale as many of the fumes and such. People can say left and right, they could be like, oh, as long as you're not using dangerous solder, it's all good, you can breathe that in. I don't want to take any chances. I'd rather just wear the mask and be okay and just preserve my lungs for later. Now, some of you might be wondering, okay, where do I start soldering? Because I don't want to botch up my nice system that I got and I paid a few $100s for, because my parents will be pissed off at me. Well, here we go. We got a system right here. This is a system I do not care about at all, but either use a system that is long gone, or use a console that is dead, or a motherboard that is dead. Just get a dead computer motherboard, get a dead console motherboard, like spend like $5-10 on eBay getting a red-ringed Xbox 360 that you don't care about or something. Because these things, honestly, if you're going to work on them, I will say, they have big components to work on, they have small components to work on. There's a lot of stuff on here for you to practice on, and they are great. Now, this console right here, it works, kind of, but I literally only use this console for LED tests. Whenever I change LED boards and such, the lights on them, I use this console just to test them and make sure the lights work and everything. Aside from that, the thing has a nasty red ring fix on it. It had this 12-volt fan mod on it. The thing is a Xenon. It's not JTAGable, it's missing the DVD key, there's so much. I mean, the system's worthless, honestly, so that's why I only use it to test out LEDs, and I'm not going to be breaking anything on this in this tutorial, but I'm going to be, demonstrating things on here, so if I botch up something, I don't care about this system. Just trust me. You might say, oh, well, this system works, but I'll just practice on it. No! If you break a system that works, you're gonna feel terrible. You're going to feel really bad. That kind of hurt a little bit, but you're going to feel really bad. Just trust me on that, okay? You are going to hate your life for the next 20 or 30 minutes, and you're going to think about it for days after that. If you botch up a system, it's going to make you feel really bad. Just use a system that is crap. Just use junk to solder on first, and once you get good with that, you start doing your first soldering job. Now let's go ahead and get into this.